from Foothills.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise in the House today and debate this Bill C-4. To be honest, a lot of the things that have been discussed and debated today are of great concern to myself, and I think many Canadians. When we talk about things like a secret ballot is unnecessary red tape and goes against the very foundation of our democracy. I find that unbelievable that many of our Liberal and NDP colleagues would make such comments on that today, that the secret ballot, the way that we elect almost every political official in our country, from federal government, provincial, municipal, and they find that to be unnecessary red tape. I would like to ask them how do they think they came into this House today? Would they prefer there not be a secret ballot or no ballot whatsoever? I really do question their frame of mind when they're talking about a secret ballot being undemocratic. And it's also quite ironic that the first piece of legislation from this government, a government who campaigned quite passionately about openness, transparency, and accountability, and yet the first piece of legislation that they bring into this House as a new government is a piece of a bill that is going to absolutely gut transparency and accountability and legislation we put forward for unions. I find that to be incredibly ironic, and I would say another broken promise by this new Liberal government. Now, equally as frustrating for myself as a member of Parliament from Alberta, I have to question the priority of this government, its motives, and why they would be bringing this piece of legislation forward right now. I'm getting calls each and every day. Welders, waitresses, pipe fitters, rig hands. They're asking me, when is this government going to come up with some kind of strategy that's going to help me get back to work? When is this government going to announce some sort of plan that is going to help my family as we're trying to make ends meet or potentially lose my job or have already lost my job? And yet, the priority of this government, when thousands of Albertans have been laid off, we heard that the Labour study was released today, 22,000 full-time jobs were lost in Alberta in January alone. Alberta's unemployment rate went to 7.4%. The first time since 1988 it's been higher than the Canadian average. What we've heard predictions is Alberta's unemployment rate will exceed 8% by the end of 2016. The highest it's been since the Liberal Party put through the National Energy Program. With thousands of Albertans, not only Albertans, but Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, thousands of families losing their jobs due to the downturn in the energy sector, the priority of this government is to reward the union bosses who helped get them elected instead of talking to Canadian families who have lost their jobs. I have to tell these families that in my discussions and debates in the House of Commons that Alberta is obviously not a priority. Canada's economy is certainly not a priority. The families who have lost their jobs is not a priority. But what is a priority is, again, rewarding those big union bosses who helped them get elected, and I find that to be extremely frustrating. The Liberal plan to repeal this legislation is a piece of legislation that was intended to ensure transparency and accountability for union leaders, and I find it very irresponsible that they're trying to repeal that type of legislation. And despite what the minister would have us believe, repealing this piece of legislation and bringing forward Bill C-4 is an attack on Canadian workers. The Minister of Employment said that she believes that repealing Bill C-37 and C-525 will restore balance to unions. The only balance that C-4 will bring is tipping the balance away from union workers back to the union leadership. I would like to point out that the overwhelming majority of actual union members are in favor of this type of legislation, the type of legislation that we put forward in Bill 377 and C-525. Ledger poll, 86% of union members supported this kind of legislation. 86%. Similar poll, 84% of all Canadians support this type of legislation that brings accountability and transparency to unions. They want to be able to vote via a secret ballot when they choose their union leadership or they vote on union business, and they want to know how their union dues are being spent. I don't think that's too much to ask. Canadians support transparency and accountability. Union members support transparency and accountability, and yet this Liberal government does not. This is a disturbing trend. It seems to be sort of a theme for this new Liberal government. One of the first things the Minister of Indigenous Affairs does when she gets her cabinet post is announces that she's going to ignore the First Nations Transparency Act, where residents and First Nations have an opportunity to see the finances of their leadership put public. The first piece of legislation by the new employment minister is to put forward a bill that guts transparency and accountability from unions. Do you see a recurring theme here? I think I do.
Just getting started.
And again, I heard today from a Liberal member in her speech that a secret ballot is by some way additional red tape that goes against the very foundation of our democracy. I just can't believe that I heard that she feels that asking union members to vote in a secret ballot somehow puts them out, that we're asking them to do too much. I think they really need to rethink the stance they're taking. And without any credible rationale or really any legitimate discussion with union members, the Liberal government is really gutting two significant pieces of legislation that were a victory for union members. And I believe the motive for this legislation in Bill C-4 is really quite simple. This is an opportunity to repay union leadership that helped get the Minister of Employment, an NDP MLA in Manitoba. This is that helped her get elected. And in fact, last week we heard that the Liberal Party was found guilty of accepting illegal union donations during a campaign event.
Shameful.
The Prime Minister's own campaign team specifically asked the union to have members be props at a campaign event, and he knew, or his campaign knew, that they would be paid $100 each. That is not the only campaign event he's had. He had another campaign event with the Carpenters District Council in Vaughan, and another with the International Union of Operating Engineers in Oakville. This has been a very cozy relationship with the unions, and I'd be curious to know if there were illegal donations made at those two campaign events as well. Now, since the election, the Prime Minister has met with the Teamsters 3 times, the Engineers Union 3 times, even the American Federation of Labor, the largest union in the United States. So he's made meeting with the unions a top priority. He's met with close to a dozen of them. And yet, during that time, we've lost thousands of jobs in the energy sector, and more to come. How many times has he met with people in the oil and gas sector? How many times has he met with stakeholders in the oil and gas industry? Once, yesterday in Calgary. So it shows you where the priorities of this government seem to lie right now. Again, the Liberal Party campaigned on accountability and transparency. It's obvious that they have no intentions of keeping this campaign promise. Canadians deserve better. At the federal level, the previous Conservative government introduced extensive reforms to ensure Canadians have trust in their political institutions. The first piece of legislation that we brought in as a Conservative government was the Accountability Act, something that we are very proud of on this side of the House, something that brought accountability and transparency to Canadians, not gutting it. The Accountability Act reformed the financing of political parties. It reduced opportunities to influence politicians through contributions and banning contributions from unions and corporations, and it leveled the playing field amongst individual contributors. We also introduced Bills 377 and 525, which made unions more transparent and accountable both to unions and to Canadians. The specific intent of these bills was to preserve the democratic rights of Canadian workers and increase public confidence that unions spend their money wisely and effectively. With the passage of this legislation, the public was empowered to gauge the effectiveness and financial integrity and health of their labour union. Now, some of the opponents, we heard that today, have said that Bill 377 was described as anti-union. And they said that union money should not be scrutinized by Canadians, let alone their own union members. This is simply not true. These unions are subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer, and they are subsidized at a very significant amount. The federal government offers generous tax benefits to workers' organizations, tax exemption on profits earned on investments, income from employers, and the profits generated from training centres. Despite receiving these substantial tax benefits, these organizations in the past were not required to put public on how they use these tax advantages. To put this in the same context, the federal government, including myself, I'm sure all of my colleagues in this room, every dime that we spend is open to the public. It's on my website. You can go and check it out right now. Provinces, municipalities, charities are asked to make these types of financial records public. The only ones who are not are unions. And it's frustrating that unions who should be accountable to their members and who receive generous tax breaks by the taxpayer dollars do not feel that they should have the same obligation to disclose their finances to the public. In most cases, the money is deducted from a payroll whether the employee wishes to be part of that union or not. The money is then subject to tax exemptions that keep $500 million out of the Canadian Treasury each year. I believe, and I think obvious from the polls that we've done, that most Canadians believe that these dollars and what is being done with these dollars should be made public. And Bill 377 is about that disclosure, and it was a positive step forward for unions and Canadian workers. It ensured that union members and Canadians could have access to the knowledge on how union money was being spent, how their membership dues were being spent, and as well as the investment in tax-exempt dollars that resulted from these dues. Bill 377 simply imposed transparency and accountability on unions, nothing more. It required labour organizations to file to public information a return with the Canadian Revenue Agency on an annual basis. Something they were doing, and we've heard that today, something they said that they've been doing in 7 provinces. And they're all of a sudden saying, well, now that we're asking you to do it across the country, that this is some sort of unbearable burden. If they're already doing it, in many cases, it's not that hard to make a second copy and give it to the CRA. The disclosure requirements would include financial statements, including the amount paid for political and lobbying activities, and the salaries paid to executive and staff. Nothing more. In addition, the bill requires the CRA to display this information on a website for the public to see. Far from targeting unions, Bill 377 does nothing more than impose the same obligations that registered charities across Canada now face. I'm a Rotarian, been a Rotarian for many years. We do our financial audits, we do our year-end audit, make sure it's available for the public to see. We certainly do not consider that to be some incredible burden. And I think if charities across Canada can somehow manage to do this, unions who receive $500 million a year through taxpayer subsidies, I think they can manage to do this as well, and their members want them to do these things. If the Minister of Employment believes that transparency and accountability is so devastating to Canadian unions, why do so many other countries have similar legislation and their unions have thrived? The United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, even France. Socialist France asked their unions to have similar legislation and put their financial documents forward to the public. Even some Canadian labour organizations already do this. If their head office is in the United States, they have to make their financials public as well. Now, some people have said this as I said, this creates an unfair burden on unions. This type of legislation has been in the United States for decades and has not impacted their collective bargaining in any way. The fact is, this bill does not regulate the activities of trade unions, how they participate in collective bargaining, or in any way how they spend their funds. This bill does not violate their Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This will stand up to, it has stood up to constitutional challenge. For example, former Supreme Court of Canada Justice Michel Bartosh released his opinion on 377 and said it was constitutional and it would be held up in the court that he sat on. So this shows a former Supreme Court Justice has said these pieces of legislation that we put forward are not unconstitutional. These bills simply provide greater transparency and accountability. Ironically, 2 things that this Liberal government campaigned on, but don't seem too eager to follow up on. Now, as I touched on earlier, a survey conducted by the leisure firm in 2013 showed that of the 1,400 Canadians that they polled, 83% said they wanted to see this type of legislation adopted by unions. And 84% of current union members also agreed. 84%. An Ananas poll done in 2011 showed similar results. So this hasn't changed. For some reason, the Liberal Party wants us to think that between 2013 and 2016, there's been an incredible earthquake and change of position with the union members. So I have to ask, when the Minister of Employment brought forward Bill C-4, did she actually consult with union members before she brought this forward? If 84% of union members in 2013 supported the type of legislation that we put forward with Bill C-377 and C-525, what has changed in 3 years? What has changed in 3 years that now they believe that the union membership has been outcrying for them to repeal this type of legislation? Certainly there has been outcry, but my bet is the union leadership, not the union members who they have failed to consult before bringing this forward. When I asked the Finance Minister earlier this week about this, I said, have you actually consulted with union members before you brought this type of legislation forward? Her answer was no answer. She couldn't answer it because I think the fact is they didn't. What she said is, I spoke to 22,000 residents in my constituency over the election. But I would like to ask her, did she ask them that her bill was going to be in favor of less democracy? Did she ask them, are you okay with us stomping on a very foundation of our democracy and getting rid of secret ballots? And does she think her Manitoba riding speaks for the rest of Canada? I'd be interested to see what her answer is on something like that. It is in the public interest that the financial information of workers' organization be disclosed because of the tax breaks they receive. It is a benefit of the union workers because they exercise their democratic right through a secret ballot. It is also the benefit of the government to consult with Canadians, as we did when we drafted this type of legislation. For example, Dan Kelly, President and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, said he supports Bill 377. He said, almost all unionized workplaces are forced to pay union dues. Therefore, unions should be required to publicly disclose how they use those funds. He also stated public financial disclosure for unions would enhance transparency and accountability with regard to trade union activities. He wasn't the only one. We had lawyers, union members, professors, all come and speak to the committee, the Senate committee, and we're supporting of this legislation. Canadian labour laws are in place to protect the rights of workers, to ensure they have a fair and productive workplace, and they can work in an environment where they feel that they can speak with their conscience. This is about balance, and it creates a fair environment in which workers are the ones making the choice, so they feel it's better suited to their needs. It is a Liberal government that intends to repeal legislation that created accountability, transparency, and fairness for workers. They plan to go back to a system that was broken and unfairly balanced. This is not what Canadians want. The Liberal Employment Minister said they were repealing Bill C-377 and Bill 525 in favour of creating a balanced network. Madam Speaker, this is exactly what our